The gym smelled like sweat and leather. It always did. Ethan stood at the center of the room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes scanned the group of teenagers sprawled across the mats. Some were stretching, some were chatting, quietly, and one or two were trying to sneak glances at their phones without him noticing. He sighed deeply, knowing this was going to be another long day. Ethan wasn't just any coach. He had spent years fighting in underground circuits before finally finding his way into teaching mixed martial arts. To him, the gym wasn't just a place to throw punches. It was a sanctuary where kids could learn discipline, strength, and how to push themselves beyond what they thought possible. But lately, it felt more like babysitting than coaching. "All right, listen up," Ethan barked, his voice cutting through the noise. The chatter stopped almost instantly. Everyone turned to face him, though not all of them looked eager. "We're doing sparring drills today, pairs of 2. No excuses, no whining. You get hit, you take it, got it?" A few heads nodded. Others stared blankly. One kid rolled his eyes. That was Jake, the troublemaker. Jake was 16, tall for his age, and carried himself like he owned the world. He wore designer sneakers that probably cost more than Ethan's rent and sported an attitude to match. Today, he smirked as if Ethan's instructions were beneath him. Ethan pointed at Jake. "You, pair up with Mia." Mia was a quiet girl who rarely spoke unless spoken to. She had been coming to the gym for months now, but she still seemed unsure of herself. Her dark hair was tied back in a ponytail, and her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her gloves. Jake groaned loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why do I have to go with her? She can barely throw a punch." Mia's cheeks flushed red, but she didn't say anything. Ethan stepped forward, narrowing the gap between him and Jake. "What's your problem, Jake?" Jake shrugged, leaning back against the ropes of the ring behind him. "No offense, coach, but Mia's wasting her time here. Maybe she should stick to yoga or something." The other kids snickered nervously. Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar heat rise in his chest. This wasn't the first time Jake had acted like this. For weeks, he'd been mouthing off during practice, making jokes at the expense of others and generally acting like he was too good for the gym. And then there was the constant bragging about his grandfather, a man Jake claimed was some kind of legendary Navy SEAL trainer. Ethan took a deep breath, reminding himself that losing his temper wouldn't help anyone. "Get in the ring," he said firmly. "Show me what you've got instead of running your mouth." Jake hesitated for a moment, clearly surprised by Ethan's tone. Then, with a cocky grin, he climbed into the ring, bouncing lightly on his toes. Mia followed, looking nervous but determined. Ethan watched them closely as they circled each other. At first, things went smoothly. Jake moved quickly, dodging Mia's attempts to land a punch while throwing playful jabs of his own. But then, something shifted. Jake landed a solid hit to Mia's shoulder, causing her to stumble backward. Instead of letting up, he pressed forward, taunting her. "Come on, Mia. Is that all you've got?" Jake laughed, ducking under her next swing. "My grandpa trained SEALs, and even they wouldn't mess with me right now." Mia gritted her teeth, her frustration evident. She lunged forward, aiming for Jake's midsection, but he sidestepped easily. The crowd of teenagers surrounding the ring began to murmur among themselves, some cheering for Mia, others laughing at Jake's antics. Ethan's patience was wearing thin. "That's enough," Ethan snapped, stepping closer to the ring. "Knock it off, Jake." Jake ignored him, continuing to mock Mia. "See? This is why people don't take girls seriously in combat sports. You don't have what it takes." That was the last straw. Without thinking, Ethan reached out and slapped Jake lightly on the back of the head. It wasn't hard, just enough to grab his attention, but it was enough to silence the entire gym. Jake froze, his eyes wide with shock. Slowly, he turned to face Ethan, his expression morphing from surprise to fury. You hit me?" Jake stammered, pointing an accusing finger at Ethan. Ethan straightened up, meeting Jake's gaze head-on. "Yeah, I did. Because you needed to shut up and focus. Now apologize to Mia." For a moment, nobody moved. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Jake muttered a half-hearted apology, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Mia mumbled something in response, but she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Jake stormed out of the ring, shoving past the other kids as he headed for the door. "Whatever," he spat over his shoulder. "I'm done with this place." The gym erupted into whispers as soon as Jake was gone. Ethan rubbed his temples, already regretting his decision. He knew slapping a student even lightly wasn't exactly professional, but Jake had been asking for it, hadn't he? Before Ethan could gather his thoughts, the sound of the gym door creaking open caught everyone's attention. A tall, broad-shouldered man walked in, his boots echoing loudly against the concrete floor. He looked older than Ethan, maybe in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. The man glanced around the room, taking in the scene before focusing on Ethan. "Are you the coach?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. Ethan nodded slowly, unsure of what to expect. "Yeah, that's me. What can I do for you?" The man extended a hand. "Name's Chuck. I heard about what happened with Jake, thought I'd stop by and see for myself." Ethan shook his hand, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. Somehow, he knew this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. Chuck smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Let's talk." The diner was quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Ethan sat across from Chuck, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He wasn't sure why he'd agreed to meet this man, but something about Chuck's presence made it hard to say no. There was a weight to him, an authority that Ethan couldn't quite put into words. "So," Chuck began, his voice low and steady, "you hit Jake." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't like being reminded of what happened earlier that day. "Yeah, I did, but it wasn't like I meant to hurt him or anything. I just lost my patience." Chuck nodded slowly, as if he understood. "Kids like Jake, they test you. Push your buttons until you snap, am I right?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "Yeah, I guess so, but still, I shouldn't have done it, not like that." Chuck leaned back in his seat, studying Ethan carefully. His sharp blue eyes seemed to see right through him. "Tell me about Jake, what's his deal?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He's cocky, always bragging about how his grandpa trained Navy SEALs or whatever. Acts like he's better than everyone else. Today he was messing with Mia, she's one of my quieter students, and wouldn't let up even when I told him to stop." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "His grandpa, huh? You believe him?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "Maybe. Maybe not. All I know is the kid talks a big game. But when it comes to actually putting in the work, he falls flat." Chuck chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Sounds familiar." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, leaning forward. Chuck paused for a moment as if deciding how much to share. Then he said, "Jake's grandfather. His name was Harold. And yeah, he really did train SEALs. Some of the best ones too." Ethan blinked in surprise. "Wait, seriously? So Jake wasn't lying?" "Not entirely," Chuck replied. "Harold was a legend, tough as nails, but fair. He believed in pushing people past their limits, not just physically, but mentally. Pain, fear, doubt. He taught us how to face all of it head on." "You knew him?" Ethan asked, his curiosity growing. Chuck nodded. "Yeah, I did. I was one of his guys back in the day. Learned everything I know from him." For a moment, Ethan didn't know what to say. He glanced out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. It felt strange to think that Jake's stories might actually be true. "So what does that have to do with me slapping Jake?" Chuck smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "It means you need to understand where Jake's coming from. The kid's got potential, whether he knows it or not. But he's also carrying around a lot of baggage, his grandpa's reputation, his own insecurities. It's all tangled up inside him." Ethan frowned. "You think I should cut him some slack?" "No," Chuck said firmly. "I'm not saying that. Discipline is important. But hitting him, even lightly, isn't going to fix the problem. You've got to figure out what makes him tick. Why does he act the way he does? What's driving him?" Ethan thought about that for a while. He'd always assumed Jake was just another spoiled teenager with too much confidence and not enough skill. But maybe there was more to it than that. Maybe Jake was trying to live up to something, or someone. He didn't fully understand. Harold, Ethan said finally. What was he like? Really like? Chuck's expression softened, as if he were remembering something far away. Harold was tough, no question about it. He pushed us harder than anyone else ever could. But he also cared. Deep down, he wanted to make sure we were ready, not just for combat, but for life. He used to say pain reveals character. That's how you find out who you really are. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing Chuck's words. Do you think Jake knows any of that? About his grandpa, I mean? Chuck shrugged. Hard to say. Some kids grow up hearing stories about their family members' accomplishments and feel proud. Others feel like they can never measure up. My guess is Jake's somewhere in the middle. They sat in silence for a while. The hum of the diner's neon sign filling the space between them. Ethan found himself thinking about his own childhood, the struggles he'd faced, the anger he'd carried with him for so long. Coaching had been his way of channeling that energy into something positive. But now, sitting here with Chuck, he wondered if he'd been doing enough. Why are you telling me all this? Ethan asked suddenly. I mean, why do you care? Chuck smiled again, this time with a hint of warmth. Because Harold's legacy matters, because kids like Jake, they're part of that legacy, whether they realize it or not. And because... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Because I see a bit of myself in you. Someone who's trying to do the right thing even if they don't always get it perfect. Ethan looked down at his coffee mug, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected this meeting to go the way it had. Somehow, Chuck's words had struck a chord deep within him. Before either of them could say anything else, Chuck reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old photograph. He slid it across the table toward Ethan. Take a look at this. Ethan picked up the photo, holding it under the dim light. It showed a group of men standing together in front of a rugged training camp. One of them, a wiry guy with piercing eyes and a stern expression, stood out among the rest. Next to him was a younger version of Chuck, smiling despite the fatigue etched on his face. That's Harold, Chuck said, pointing to the man in the center. And that's me, back when I still had hair. Ethan chuckled softly, studying the image. Something about it felt powerful, almost sacred. These weren't just soldiers. They were warriors shaped by hardship and dedication. Keep it, Chuck said. Maybe it'll remind you of what we're talking about here. Ethan nodded, slipping the photo into his pocket. Thanks for everything. Chuck stood up, grabbing his leather jacket from the seat beside him. Don't mention it. Just remember, one slap won't define Jake, but how you handle things, moving forward might. With that, Chuck turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. As the door swung shut behind him, Ethan realized he had a lot to think about, and even more to change. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Chuck. It replayed in his mind like a broken record. Every word, every pause, every detail. He kept pulling out the old photograph Chuck had given him, staring at it whenever he had a quiet moment. Harold's stern face seemed to stare back, challenging him to live up to something bigger than himself. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the gym early, determined to approach things differently. He wasn't sure exactly how to change yet, but he knew one thing. Jake deserved another chance. Maybe not because of who his grandfather was, but because Ethan owed it to himself and to all his students to be better. When Jake walked into the gym later that day, Ethan noticed immediately. The teenager looked sullen, his shoulders hunched, as if carrying the weight of the world. He avoided eye contact with everyone, heading straight for the locker room without saying a word. Ethan took a deep breath and followed him inside. Jake? Ethan called out softly, closing the door behind him. Jake froze, his hand halfway to his duffel bag. Without turning around, he muttered, "What do you want?" "I wanted to talk," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm. "About what happened yesterday." Jake finally turned, his expression guarded. "You already hit me. What else is there to say?" Ethan winced inwardly. He hadn't expected forgiveness, but hearing the bitterness in Jake's voice stung more than he'd anticipated. Look, I'm not here to make excuses. What I did was wrong, but I need you to understand why I reacted the way I did. Jake crossed his arms, clearly skeptical. Fine. Explain. Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who thought they were untouchable because of their family name. They acted like nothing mattered except proving how great they were. And you know what? That attitude got them hurt. Not physically, but in ways that stuck with them for years. Jake frowned, his defenses starting to crack just slightly. So what? Are you saying I'm going to end up like that person? No, Ethan replied quickly. I'm saying I don't want you to. You've got talent, Jake, real talent, but talent isn't enough. Discipline, respect, humility. Those are the things that turn potential into greatness. Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced down at his sneakers, scuffing the toe against the floor. For a brief moment, Ethan saw vulnerability in the teenager's eyes, a flicker of doubt, maybe even fear. What does any of this have to do with my grandpa? Jake asked quietly. Ethan pulled the photograph from his pocket and handed it to Jake. Take a look at this. Jake stared at the image, his brow furrowing as he studied the faces. Is that him? Yeah, Ethan confirmed. That's your grandpa, Harold. And that's Chuck next to him, the guy I met last night. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he held the photo. How do you even know him? He served under your grandpa, Ethan explained. He told me stories about how tough Harold was, but also how much he cared about the people he trained. Your grandpa didn't just teach combat skills, he taught life lessons. Jake looked up, his expression conflicted. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you're selling yourself short, Ethan said firmly. You keep talking about how great your grandpa was, but you're too busy running your mouth to actually follow in his footsteps. If you really want to honor him, start by respecting the people around you, including Mia. Jake opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Something in Ethan's tone must have struck a nerve because instead of snapping back, he simply nodded. All right, Jake said finally. But I'm not promising anything. That's fine, Ethan replied with a small smile. Just show up tomorrow ready to work. We'll take it from there. Over the next few days, Ethan began implementing new strategies in his coaching. Inspired by Chuck's stories about Harold, he introduced unconventional drills designed to test not just physical strength but mental toughness as well. One exercise involved blindfolding pairs of students and having them navigate obstacle courses together, forcing them to rely on trust and communication. Another required them to hold heavy weights above their heads while answering questions about their goals and fears. At first, Jake struggled. His natural instinct was to rush through tasks or complain when things got difficult. But Ethan noticed something interesting. Despite his protests, Jake never gave up. Even when he failed, he kept coming back for more. Mia, on the other hand, thrived under the new system. Her quiet determination earned her praise from both Ethan and the other students. She started standing taller, speaking up more, and even offering encouragement to those who needed it. Watching her grow gave Ethan hope, not just for her, but for everyone in the gym. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling session, Ethan pulled Jake aside. You're improving, he said simply. Keep it up. Jake blinked in surprise. Thanks, I guess. You don't have to thank me, Ethan replied with a grin. Just don't let it go to your head. For the first time in weeks, Jake smiled. A genuine, unguarded smile that made him look younger somehow. It was a small victory, but Ethan considered it a step in the right direction. As the days turned into weeks, rumors began spreading around town about Chuck's visit to the gym. People whispered about his connection to Harold and speculated about whether he might return. Some wondered if Ethan's methods were changing because of it. While Ethan tried to ignore the gossip, he couldn't deny that meeting Chuck had shifted something inside him. Late one evening, as Ethan was locking up the gym, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. Harold believed pain reveals character. Keep pushing them. Chuck. Ethan stared at the screen for a long time, the words sinking in. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and headed home, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Chuck returned to the gym. This time he didn't come alone. 2 other men accompanied him, both veterans, judging by their posture and demeanor. They moved with a quiet confidence that commanded respect, without saying a word. Ethan immediately recognized one of them as someone who had been in the photograph Chuck had shown him. Chuck greeted Ethan with a firm handshake before turning to address the group of students gathered in the gym. Jake, Mia, and several others stood nervously, unsure what to expect. The air felt heavy with anticipation. "Listen up," Chuck began, his voice carrying authority. "We're here today because we heard about the work you've been doing under Coach Ethan. We think some of you might have what it takes to handle a real challenge." The teenagers exchanged glances, excitement mingling with apprehension. Ethan stepped forward, sensing the need to clarify. "What kind of challenge are we talking about?" Chuck smiled faintly. "Something inspired by Harold's training methods. A 2-day endurance test out in the woods. Physical challenges, mental tests, and moments where you'll question whether you can keep going. Only the strongest will finish." Ethan frowned, concerned. "Are you sure this is safe?" "It's not dangerous if they're prepared," Chuck assured him, "but it'll push them harder than anything they've ever faced. That's the point, to see what they're made of." Jake raised his hand hesitantly. "What happens if we quit?" "You walk away knowing your limits," Chuck replied bluntly. "But trust me, those who finish won't forget the experience." After a brief discussion, Ethan agreed to let Jake, Mia, and 3 other standout students participate. The rest of the day was spent preparing supplies and going over safety protocols. Ethan noticed how serious the mood became. Even Jake seemed unusually subdued, though there was a spark of determination in his eyes. Early the next morning, the group set out for the forest on the outskirts of town. The trial began at sunrise, with Chuck and his companions leading the way. The first task was deceptively simple. Navigate a mile-long trail marked by colored flags while carrying a weighted backpack. Most of the teens managed it without too much trouble, but a few struggled under the added weight. By mid-morning, the challenges grew tougher. One exercise required the group to cross a shallow but fast-moving stream, using only a rope tied between 2 trees. Mia hesitated at first, her fear of heights evident, but Jake surprised everyone by staying behind to coach her through it. "You've got this," he encouraged, his tone softer than usual. "Just focus on the rope and take it one step at a time." Mia nodded, gripping the rope tightly. With Jake's steady encouragement, she made it across, collapsing onto the bank with relief. For the first time, Ethan saw genuine camaraderie forming between them. As the hours passed, fatigue set in. The group faced tasks like building a shelter from scratch, solving riddles under pressure, and enduring periods of silence to test their patience. Some participants dropped out early, overwhelmed by exhaustion or frustration. By nightfall, only Jake, Mia, and 2 others remained. Chuck called for a break as darkness fell. The remaining teens huddled around a small fire, eating energy bars and sharing water. Despite their weariness, there was a sense of pride in the air. They had survived the first day. Jake stared into the flames, lost in thought. Finally, he spoke. "Do you think my grandpa really did stuff like this?" Mia glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "Probably. From what Coach told us, he sounds like someone who pushed people to be their best." Jake nodded slowly. "I guess I never really thought about what that meant before. I just liked telling people he trained SEALs because it sounded cool." "Well, maybe now you can actually live up to it," Mia said with a small smile. Jake returned the smile, though faintly. For the first time, Ethan noticed a change in him, not just physically, but emotionally. The cocky bravado was fading, replaced by something quieter but more substantial. Day 2 brought even greater challenges. At one point, the group had to crawl through a muddy trench while being sprayed with cold water, an exercise designed to simulate combat conditions. Jake gritted his teeth and pushed through, refusing to complain despite the discomfort. When Mia slipped and fell behind, he reached back to help her up, ignoring the mud covering his hands. Later, they faced a psychological test. Sitting alone in complete darkness for 20 minutes while listening to recorded messages meant to provoke fear or doubt. Jake clenched his fists, focusing on his breathing to stay calm. When the lights came back on, he looked shaken but resolute. By the final stretch, only Jake and Mia were left. The last task involved scaling a steep hill and ringing a bell at the top, a symbolic gesture of completing the trial. As they climbed, their legs burning with effort, Ethan watched from below, feeling a swell of pride. When Jake reached the summit first, he didn't ring the bell right away. Instead, he waited for Mia to catch up. Together they grabbed the rope and rang it in unison, their cheers echoing through the forest. Chuck and his companions greeted them at the bottom, offering nods of approval. "You've earned this," Chuck said simply. "Not many people could have done what you just did." Jake looked at Mia, then at Ethan, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thanks for pushing me," he said quietly. "I wouldn't have made it without you guys." Ethan clapped him on the shoulder. "You did the hard part, kid. All I did was give you a chance to prove yourself." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the forest, Ethan realized something important. The trial wasn't just about testing limits. It was about building bonds. Jake and Mia weren't the same people they'd been 2 days ago. Neither was he. The trial in the woods changed everything, not just for Jake and Mia, but for the entire gym. When they returned to Ironville the following week, Ethan noticed an immediate shift in the energy. The teenagers who had participated in the endurance test carried themselves differently, taller, prouder, as if they'd discovered something within themselves that couldn't be taken away. Even those who hadn't gone on the trial seemed inspired by their stories. Jake was the most noticeable change. Gone was the cocky attitude and constant bragging. Instead, he approached training with a quiet determination, focusing not just on himself but also on helping others improve. He started mentoring younger students, offering tips during sparring sessions, and encouraging them when they struggled. Ethan watched from the sidelines, amazed at how much Jake had grown in such a short time. Mia, too, stepped into a leadership role. Her confidence soared after completing the trial, and she became a voice of calm and reason among her peers. She, often paired up with newer students, patiently guiding them through drills and reminding them to stay focused. Together, Jake and Mia created a dynamic that brought out the best in everyone around them. Ethan decided to build on this momentum. Inspired by Chuck's methods, he introduced more team-based exercises designed to foster trust and cooperation. One drill involved blindfolding pairs of students and having them guide each other through an obstacle course, using only verbal instructions. Another required groups to solve puzzles under time pressure, while performing physical tasks like holding planks or doing push-ups. These new challenges pushed the students to rely on one another, breaking down barriers and building stronger connections. Ethan saw friendships forming where there had once been rivalry. Kids who used to argue over locker space now cheered each other on during workouts. The gym felt less like a collection of individuals and more like a community. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Ethan gathered everyone in the center of the room. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "I want to talk about what we've been doing here lately." The teens quieted down, turning their attention to him. Ethan took a deep breath before continuing. "When I first started coaching, I thought my job was to teach you how to fight, how to throw punches, block kicks, win matches. And yeah, that's part of it. But over the past few weeks, I've realized something important. Fighting isn't just about strength or skill. It's about heart, about knowing who you are and why you're doing what you're doing." He paused, letting his words sink in. That trial in the woods, it wasn't just about testing your limits. It was about showing you what you're capable of when you work together, when you support each other instead of tearing each other down. Jake raised his hand hesitantly. "So, what does that mean for us moving forward?" Ethan smiled. "It means we're going to keep pushing ourselves, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. We're going to train harder, sure, but we're also going to lift each other up, because that's what real warriors do." The group erupted into applause, some of the kids nodding enthusiastically. Ethan felt a surge of pride as he looked around the room. These weren't just students anymore. They were a team. Chuck made occasional appearances, always bringing new insights and stories about Harold. During one visit, he handed Ethan a folder filled with notes and diagrams detailing advanced training techniques. "Harold left these behind," Chuck explained. "Thought you might find them useful." Ethan flipped through the pages, marveling at the depth of Harold's knowledge. There were strategies for improving reflexes, mental conditioning exercises, and even advice on teaching resilience. It was clear that Harold hadn't just trained soldiers, he'd shaped leaders. Inspired, Ethan began incorporating some of Harold's methods into his coaching. He introduced visualization exercises, asking students to imagine themselves succeeding in difficult situations. He emphasized the importance of mindfulness, teaching them to control their breathing and stay present during moments of stress. Slowly but surely, the gym evolved into something far greater than a place to learn martial arts. It became a hub for personal growth. As the weeks turned into months, rumors spread throughout the town about the changes happening at Iron Will. Parents noticed improvements in their children, not just in terms of athleticism, but in their attitudes and behavior outside the gym. Teachers reported fewer conflicts and better focus in school. Even local businesses started sponsoring tournaments hosted by the gym, recognizing its positive impact on the community. One day, Chuck showed up unexpectedly, accompanied by two familiar faces. The veterans who had helped run the trial. They stood near the entrance, observing the chaos of a typical training session. Ethan greeted them warmly, curious about their sudden appearance. "We've been watching," Chuck said, his tone serious but kind. "What you're building here, it's special." Harold would have been proud. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "Thanks. That means a lot." Chuck nodded, then gestured toward Jake and Mia, who were demonstrating a technique to a group of younger students. Those two, they're carrying on Harold's legacy, whether they realize it or not. So are you. Before Ethan could respond, Chuck handed him another envelope. Inside were more photographs along with a handwritten letter. The letter detailed Harold's vision for creating a network of trainers who would pass on his teachings, not just in combat, but in shaping resilient, compassionate individuals. "This is bigger than any one person," Chuck said firmly. "It's about leaving something behind that lasts." Ethan stared at the letter, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. For so long, he'd seen himself as just a coach, a guy trying to make ends meet while helping kids stay out of trouble. But now he understood that his role was far greater. He was part of something larger, something timeless. That night, Ethan stayed late at the gym reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about Jake, whose arrogance had given way to humility and strength, about Mia, whose quiet determination had blossomed into leadership, about all the students who came to the gym looking for guidance and left with purpose. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly fulfilled. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, days when patience wore thin and progress seemed slow. But he also knew that as long as he kept pushing forward, staying true to the values Harold had instilled in people like Chuck, he could make a difference. As he locked up the gym and headed home, Ethan glanced back at the building one last time. Its lights glowed softly in the darkness, a beacon of hope for anyone willing to step inside. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Months had passed since the trial in the woods, and Iron Will Gym had transformed into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It was no longer just a place to learn how to throw punches or kick properly. It had become a sanctuary, where young people discovered their potential, built confidence, and formed lifelong friendships. Ethan stood near the edge of the mat, watching Jake and Mia spar under the fading sunlight streaming through the high windows. Jake moved with precision now, his earlier arrogance replaced by focus and control. He blocked Mia's jabs effortlessly, countering with calculated strikes that stopped just short of making contact. Mia, too, had grown stronger, not just physically but mentally. Her movements were fluid, her defense nearly impenetrable. The two of them worked together like partners rather than opponents, pushing each other to be better without malice or ego. Ethan couldn't help but smile. These kids weren't just training anymore, they were thriving. They carried themselves differently now, walking taller, speaking with more conviction, and treating others with respect. Even the younger students looked up to Jake and Mia as role models, eager to follow in their footsteps. As the session wound down, Ethan called everyone to gather in the center of the room. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice firm but warm. "We've come a long way since I first started coaching here. You've all worked hard, pushed yourselves, and supported each other, and because of that, this gym has become something special." The teens nodded, their faces glowing with pride. Ethan continued, "But remember, it's not about being the strongest or the fastest, it's about becoming the best version of yourself, about learning discipline, resilience, and how to lift others up when they need it most." Jake raised his hand hesitantly. "Coach, do you think my grandpa would be proud of me?" Ethan met Jake's gaze, seeing the vulnerability behind his question. "Absolutely," he replied without hesitation. Harold trained warriors, sure, but not just fighters. He shaped leaders, people who cared about others and stood up for what was right. And if he were here today, I know he'd see that same spirit in you. Jake's eyes softened, gratitude shining through. For so long, he'd felt like he was living in his grandfather's shadow, trying to measure up to a legacy he barely understood. But now he realized that Harold's teachings weren't about perfection, they were about growth, about striving to be better every single day. Mia stepped forward, her voice steady. "What happens next? Are we done growing?" Ethan chuckled, softly. "Never. Growth doesn't stop. It just changes direction. Some of you might compete in tournaments. Others might go on to teach what you've learned here. And some of you might take these lessons into your everyday lives, using them to face whatever challenges come your way." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The important thing is that you keep moving forward, keep supporting each other, because that's what makes us strong, not just as individuals, but as a team." The group erupted into applause, their cheers filling the gym with energy. Ethan felt a swell of pride as he looked around the room. These kids weren't just students anymore, they were family. Later that evening, after the gym had emptied and the mats had been rolled up, Chuck walked in unannounced. Ethan wasn't surprised. Somehow Chuck always seemed to show up when he was least expected. "How's it going?" Chuck asked, leaning casually against the doorway. Ethan grinned, gesturing toward the empty space where the students had been, practicing. "Better than ever. These kids, they're incredible. They've taken everything we've thrown at them and turned it into something amazing." Chuck nodded approvingly. That's what Harold would have wanted. A chain reaction.
Passing on what he taught to the next generation.
Ethan hesitated for a moment before asking the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Do you think we're doing enough? Living up to his legacy, I mean." Chuck smiled faintly, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Ethan's. "You're doing more than enough. Legacy isn't about perfection, it's about impact. And you're making an impact, Ethan. Every time you push these kids to be better, every time you remind them why they're here, you're honoring Harold's memory." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't realized until that moment how much he needed to hear those words. All this time, he'd been so focused on getting things right that he hadn't stopped to appreciate how far they'd come. "Thanks," Ethan said quietly, "for everything." Chuck clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't thank me. Thank yourself, and those kids out there. They're the ones carrying the torch now." As Chuck left, Ethan stayed behind, sitting cross-legged on the mat. He thought about the journey they'd been on, the struggles, the breakthroughs, the moments of triumph. He thought about Jake, whose arrogance had given way to humility and strength. About Mia, whose quiet determination had blossomed into leadership. About all the students who came to the gym looking for guidance and left with purpose. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly at peace. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, days when patience wore thin and progress seemed slow. But he also knew that as long as he kept pushing forward, staying true to the values Harold had instilled in people like Chuck, he could make a difference. As he locked up the gym and headed home, Ethan glanced back at the building one last time. Its lights glowed softly in the darkness, a beacon of hope for anyone willing to step inside. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Weeks later, Ethan received another envelope from Chuck. Inside was a note, simple yet profound. The greatest victories are the ones that inspire others to win their own battles. Ethan pinned the note to the wall of his office, where it served as a reminder of why he did what he did. Iron Will Gym wasn't just a place to train fighters. It was a place to build warriors of character. Warriors who would carry Harold's legacy forward, shaping the world in ways big and small. And as Ethan watched Jake and Mia lead a group of new students through their first drills, he knew the future was bright, not just for them, but for everyone lucky enough to walk through the doors of Iron Will.